Good afternoon and most welcome to H869. We are now recording actually in the cellar of the University Library of Gothenburg, and we're having a lovely day outside. It's once more sunshine, and I passed the garden that we recorded in 2 episodes ago in 867, and it seemed flowering is advancing rapidly. So if we're in any luck and we will have a little rainfall, I think spring is going to be here rather early this year. Nobody knows. Today I will turn the tables on the story. I will reverse the former approach where we've been looking at mostly what is looked upon, the object or the direction of our intention. Now we're going to look at what is looking, and the fine thing with the mirror is you can always turn the table, so to speak. It's reversible, and I would say this reversibility is the most important trait, to understand that everything can be reversed, should be reversed, and reversibility is a part of the feature, so to speak. And I call it the matter of the subject, and that also the subject is ridden by presence. So I did a little drawing here from, well, it's partly coming directly from Rodolphe Gasché's book, The Tane of the Mirror. So in this reversal we have the ego being present, the subject, me, and it's here and it's now. And the third or fourth feature, it's full, it's existence. I exist. I existed before, I exist now, and I will exist in the future. It's full of this solidity of existence, and you get a sense of it being completely dense. I think mostly of the ventral side going haywire, being very, very heavy, a little bit like the Parmenian descent into complete solidity where nothing happens. And in this example, the object is insubstantial. It's just a shadow, it's just surface, I think would be the correct. I think you all recognize this ordinary perception of the things around you being not of this world, being otherworldly, being just the surface. For instance, take this computer. The inside we know nothing about. We don't even know its full workings. And this is a new feature of our world. It didn't used to be that. Everything used to be understood. And I earlier took the example from people living in harmony with nature, Indians and people living in southwestern Africa, like Namibia. They know the inner lives of everything around them, and we used to have that knowledge too. What all the plants were called, a little history about them, if they're good for something, where they usually grow, and that gives dimension to the thing. It gives tangibility. They are something for you, to use a Heideggerian phrase. They are present. In this case, everything is absent. It's not there. It's over there. It's also in the past. And in contrast to the full presence of me going around here, especially looking at a computer, it feels empty, and I feel full. It's like I have all the superficial experience of the computer in me. I sort of digest it. I observe it. I am the holder and the owner of the perception. But the perception is very shallow. We are not intimate. The computer is not a true other. It's like Martin Buber would say, it's not a du. It's more like a Z or ni, as we say in Swedish. It doesn't really have an equivalence in English, but it's a reserved way of using the second form, the second pronoun. It's also copy, because I come here in the full presence, being heavy, solid, existing over time, demanding my existence. And I'm coming here and presencing. And it's almost like I see all these dead things around me. And that will be even more clear when we think about the modern way of perceiving other people. The perception of other people today is not the old one. The old perception of other human beings were soulful people. Even if they were bad, they all had a soul. So you saw a soul, or you met a soul, or you had dealings with a soul. But today, the other form of existence is something distant to us. It's just a shelf. It's just a shell. And within that, it's never a soul. And I think that's interesting. Nobody perceives another human being as a soul anymore. And of course, one could blame modern science, biology, where people are reduced to being matter, neurons, whatever, and don't having a soul. But it's a completely different way of seeing the world. Completely different. It is scary, and when this development really started catching on, people wrote about it as being horrifying. Now we're used to it. I think seeing people as a soulful creature is very rare today. We don't see them as soul. We see them as something moving about, maybe energized like a car from gasoline, or this computer doing its working thanks to it being connected to the current in our walls, in our grounds, in our system. And it is very close. The experiments one did, the research one have done, shows it. We really see other people as moving robots or clocks or something like that. And it has a negative side, and I think it makes this presencing even bigger, because I am the only one conscious. Indirectly, this is a claim of a singular consciousness. And I would say this is not something we are aware of, but it's a hidden assumption, sort of. I am the only soulful. I wouldn't say it goes that far as solipsism, but there is a hint of it. It's I am the only one who are existing. But oddly enough, we turn ourselves into the machines by looking at other people as very complicated mechanical things. We start to move about mechanically, and we start to think mechanically, repetitive, like a computer that is actually incredibly repetitive. It's not so advanced as we think. When we sit in front of the computer, we are amazed. This is a little god or something. But actually, it is far from complex in that sense that a human being can be complex. It's a difference that above all makes itself very clear in the development of artificial intelligence and so forth, and the science of cognition. Very seldom this is not evident, but I would say in the words of common man, this is the case. The subject needs to be full, and the object is what fills me up. I'm consisting of the objects. Compare here with René Descartes' idea that his thoughts was all he was. And the thoughts, they were nothing but reflection from the outside. See the mirror once more. Here we have Descartes. What is reflected from the outside makes his thoughts automatically. So there is no possibility of a free will here, because there is an outside and that impinges on your consciousness, and it makes thoughts, and those thoughts are something you make equivalence to what is your I. See, it's like outside is the same as your I. So this reduction is not a new thing, but of course in the modern reality it has a completely different shape, and it's a shape, I would say, it's rather limiting. It doesn't have to be that way, and actually this desired fullness is of course also self-sufficient, as in the system I showed yesterday, a system that proves itself, like the idea of mathematics in Hilbert and Gödel, the idea that the system is self-sufficient, coherent and non-contradictory. Everything that is needed is within this unit. Nothing needs to come in. And there is no chance of any movement. It's complete stillness. This is a world or a consciousness that is stillborn. And remember the incredible surprise of Gödel himself and Hilbert and all the society in 1926 when his theorem came. It was like a flash from outer sky, and it sent them into devastation. It was an absolute depression. As I said so many times before, Gödel died only a couple of years later, starved himself to death. And Hilbert, he never changed. He got into a depression, and the rest of his life was a misery. And that shows that perceived idea being so important, although it's so crippling, although this self-sufficient makes experience impossible. Why is that? Well, where everything is coherent and everything is non-contradictory, there cannot be anything new. There is no experience coming in, because experience in itself is difference. Contradiction is what makes up experience. This is the thing of Heidegger, the thea and the aletheia, the covering and the uncovering, the remembering and the forgetting, or not forgetting as it's supposed to be. And that is the process of presencing. Presencing is the word Heidegger used for, it's hard to say, but it is live reality that is not stable, that is not static, that moves, because these contradictions makes a movement. The difference makes the movement. Well, it's like the snake, because it cannot move without changing what is ventral, what is dorsal. And oddly enough, in a snake, the only movement it does, because it doesn't have any arms, doesn't have any legs, it doesn't have any wings, the only movement it does is this change of dorsal and ventral. and that leads to the movement of the snake. And even more fantastic with the snake, it used to have legs. So it didn't start with a legless creature. It got rid of the legs because the actual difference was more effective. And you know, for instance, a rattlesnake can move about in 40 miles an hour. It's just incredible. You can't run from such an animal. I thought I could. I tried it once. It wasn't a rattlesnake, thank God. But it was a similar snake, and it started to hunt me, I thought. So I ran from it, and I didn't manage. It actually was quicker than me. An odd experience. I have a site here because this is one of those things that the mirror is very helpful to help us understand. And I would say the metaphor is in itself a sort of reflexive thing. When we think ourselves like something that is a metaphor, everything is lightening up. It doesn't become so dense. And this is a special account you find here in the chapter of heterology. Heterology is in contrast to homology, similarness. Heterology is the difference, the contradictions. Page 87 we have, starting for Rodolphe Gasché. Since I have suggested all new accounts of reflexivity must measure up to Hegel's speculative and absolute reflection, and since this is even more the case for the approach that I'm outlining, and which is concerned with the entirety of the argumentative structures that led from the aporias to the dialectical fluidization. And fluidization is this movement that comes when you have difference or contradictions. The movement is shown in Heidegger as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And this is a specific take on it. It uses the speculative and the absolute reflection from Hegel, and also adds to this something I call, Rodolphe Gasché called, isolated reflection. Isolated reflection is when you only see one side. And by combining these three modes of the mirror, these pre-ontological modes, you get this fluidity of thinking. Here is a saying, a direct quote from Dieter Henrik, an idealist philosopher from Germany. Henrik writes, 1. The first task of philosophy, from whose solution one obtains the solution of all its other tasks, is the correct comprehension of the difference that still breaches the idea of self-relation. 2. One cannot expect to be able to think a self-relation that would be the result of a simple difference, or even an exclusion of all difference. There is nothing such an immediate yet closed self-relation. Real self-relation includes, on the contrary, the development of the difference that it contains into a form which is so complex that it can no longer be distinguished from the totality of what is. And this goes to show that by allowing difference and sort of stepping away from fullness and presence and letting those traits come in like difference, we gain this fluidity. And I would say that this fluidity is the thinking process. the thinking process that is lost in this solidification. And this solidification we not only see in the individual, we see it in society as such. Everything has become fossilized, petrified. I think that's a good word, petrified. The fluidity comes when difference in a very radical way, that something being completely different is taken into the system. This is what starts the fluidity. But if you're looking for sameness, if you look for coherence, if you look for consistency, you lose everything that is moving, thinking, and also reflecting. Reflection is lost. And that's the second trait, which is very typical of modern society. We have become, more or less, what we think the exterior is. We have become more or less repetitive robots in our thinking, because this is predictable. And here comes neurology in. We know modern people are predictable. There are easy algorithms that can predict the behavior of people. But if you go to simpler cultures, or even if you find some people that are very ancient, they're not predictable. And I can tell you, if you go back like a few centuries, people were not predictable. Their thinking was not stillborn, it was constantly new. They were creative, these were the genius of thinking, and that was also the time, here's another third point, that was the time when thinking mattered. People listened to the thinkers. Now we are here almost discarded out of society. I hope we can meet up with my friend David. He has a lot of complaints about this, because nobody's listening to the intellectuals anymore. Today not, but it didn't used to be the case. And there are good reasons for that. It has to do with the solidification of thinking itself. It has become something that is repetitive, the same. The sameness comes from the idea of the perfection in the mirror, and our stuckedness in the real existing Hans. What is really me? What is my soul? And I had a word for that. What did I call that? I was thinking of this chap, maybe we'll meet on Monday, I don't know, but it was a conversational friend I had for a couple of years, Håkan, and he was very much into the solidity of the soul. It had to really be consistent, it had to be full, it had to be existent. And just to tease him because he was obsessed of him, that wasn't an argument from me in that time. I just said, it doesn't matter to me if my soul doesn't exist for a while. What? He bursted out. You really cling to the idea of the full presence. But the thing is, and the lesson from the mirror and this deconstruction of this idea of existence, presence here, is that everything that we want is lost in this process. Everything we want of permanence, and permanence is the movement, is the fluidity. There is a permanence, and that permanence cannot be shaken. And I think maybe that is actually the original mystical or religious or philosophical message. There is a part of us that we can develop that is unshakable, untouchable, and it doesn't disappear. It is like the maelstrom in the river. It doesn't matter how much stones you throw in. It doesn't matter if there's a flow. There are maelstroms that there are at least a couple of 100 years old. This is how reality works. This is not how it works. This stability, this is losing of permanence. This is actually giving up permanence in this life, and giving up the capability to be abstract. And because of identity, I cannot reflect upon myself, because all that thinking is deemed to be utterly subjective and useless. Well, not useless, but of lower quality. Only the material for fiction, not in fact, not in regular debate. That's subjective. It comes from this fixation, and this fixation is, of course, I mentioned before, a bodily fixation as well. We are stiff today. We really are like the stiff-necked people of the Bible. We're refusing to see there is an opportunity, that there is something higher, and that there is something permanent. I always felt Håkan really didn't want to go into permanence. He wanted to be just this instantaneous, just for a microsecond, in the presence of the fullness. Permanence seemed to be too great, too fantastic, too miraculous, I would say. So that was almost directly left out of the picture. Too fantastic to be believed. I would say, well, maybe it's fantastic and it's hard to believe, but it's still true. Close to this, on page 304, and now I skip to this very chapter I was starting to mention, literature or philosophy. And that could also be literature or facts, or why not dreams and facts. But the chapter's name is Literature or Philosophy, and this is coming from chapter, page 304. But the function of analogy, and this is close to metaphor, is not exhausted by establishing such a continuity and homogeneity. This is the homogeneity and this is the continuity. Through a relation of proportionality or an attribution between homologous elements. There's a quote here. The analogical process is also a refluence towards the logos. The origin is the logos. The origin of analogy, that from which analogy proceeds and to which it returns, is the logos, reason and word. End of quote. In metaphysics, analogy is suspended upon the non-analogical logos as its origin. So what it originates in is something that is not an analogy. And that could be compared to the pre-ontological or the pre-reflective, the first thing we see in the mirror, so to speak, before we started to have a concept. In economimesis, we read that what regulates all analogy, and which is itself not analogical, since it forms the ground of analogy, is the logos of analogy, towards which everything flows back, but which itself remains without system. So there is something in the bottom that is not an analogy. This is the starting point. It remains also without the system. Outside of the system that it orients as its end and its origin, its embouchure and its source. As Derrida has demonstrated in Plato's Pharmacy, a certain dominating and decisive hierarchization takes place between the terms of the relations that enter into correspondence in relation of analogy. And this is very close, because in this presencing we have no chance of making an analogy. Everything is within the system, nothing could be without it. And this is similar to have a closed book, if that is possible, where all the terms in the book are described or derived from all other words. It's a closed system. And the idea of the ego, of the observer, of the me, of the originator or the origo, is that I am self-sufficient, so to speak. All I do in my head becomes true because I make it true myself. And you see here how I literally shut myself out. And this is the fixation into the mirror. I give up the reflection that comes to me. I say that is not part of reality. There is something different. And as I sent a photo earlier on, this distorted Hans Johansson that came out of the photo, much thinner actually, thank God, only for a second. I directly thought, this is unreal. That was the whole idea with this mirror. But think about it closely. How unreal is it? Is it not part of perception? I would say. Is not the whole system we talk about when we speak about illusions, fiction, dreams, fantasies, wishes, miracles, you name it. And on the other hand, facts, solidity, presence, science. You see, there is a mirror reflection. And whereas the thing that is more real, looking into the mirror, is of course fact, non-fiction, reality, science, well, you get the zest of it. The thing coming back, that's the dream. That's my wishes. Could also be your emotions, an illusion. The division is always made, but one of the sides somehow usually takes this shape of presencing, being here, being now, being full of existence. And this existence is of course this Parmenian descent, as I mentioned. Completely solid, really heavy. And this heaviness we all remember when we took classes in an analytical philosophy. Being to those classes is what like having a ton of bricks on top of you. You felt heavy, literally, because it's a weight on your shoulder and you can't even breathe. It is kept you like this, and you try to keep on to this fullness, this presencing for your bare life, like a person standing on a boat that is going by the waves, holding on to the mast, thinking we are going under or something like that. The harder that person holds to the mast, the lesser he perceives, the lesser he works. And maybe we see a return of the metaphor in an essay from Derrida, The Retreat of Metaphor. Derrida advances his elaboration of the structure of metaphoricity, or quasi-metaphoricity, as he calls it here, by analyzing a tropic movement which is complementary to the violent catachrestic production I have outlined. Sorry. A little cuckoo in my throat. In this essay, the articulation that is said to be more originary than the distinction of metaphor and concept is said to be more originary than the distinction of metaphor and concept. That splits, intersects, and recuts it is analyzed in terms of the Heideggerian notion of trait, Zug, or tyg in Swedish. Having a trait. So you see, reality is the thing having the traits, and this is giving up the traits of reality. And you no longer have this interesting fractal distinction of reality. You don't have this presence of being close to anything. You are not at do with the things you have around you. They're not for you anymore. They are absent, and you just use them somehow. And I think this is a good point to get out in the sun for a while. It was a bit exhausting. But I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you for your patience.